Okay, so on substance, what I wanted to cover this afternoon. So, you know, every year we have a panel on foreign affairs. And usually what we do is we look at the hotspots throughout the world and discuss what the current US administration is going to do or not going to do, what it should do, etc. But this year, given the war in Ukraine, I thought it was a good idea to look at the debate that has been reignited in the US about the role of the country, or the role of the United States in the world. Because in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February and March, the debate was raging in America on what the US should do. Should it defend democracy and defend Ukraine and send help, send military and humanitarian aid to the country? Or should it not do so much and concentrate on rebuilding the country and escape foreign adventures and foreign wars? This debate, I think, is at the center of foreign policy in the US. It has been at the center of this policy for decades, really, or maybe for centuries. But this year, 2022, it has been given new life by the Ukraine invasion. And I thought we would concentrate on that. And so I'm very happy to have 4 speakers. So 2 are on Zoom and 2 are in the room. The first one, Ian Lesser from GMF in Brussels, will give us the view of the international liberals, those who want to intervene to save democracy. Then we'll have Emma Ashford from the Stimson Center, who will give us the rationale of the restrainer camp in DC or in America. Then we'll hear, just a minute, so on fait la France en premier ou l'Europe en premier? Oui, on va faire l'Europe. Then we'll have a view, we'll have Jacques Rupnik give us the perspective from Central European countries. What do those countries, such as Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, of course, and the others, what are they expecting from the US today and tomorrow? And then, last but not least, the French view, because we have to do that in Paris. And this is thanks to Manuel Lafont Rapnouil, who works for CAPS, which is policy planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he will give us the view from Paris. Okay, so without further ado, maybe Ian Lesser could magically appear on the screen, and we'll give him the floor.
Good to be with you. I'm very sorry not to be there in person, but nice to be with you this way. Just look, a few thoughts. Obviously you frame this in a way that makes it an interesting debate, and that's all to the good. I would say that this sort of internationalist vision, if you like that, I guess I sort of fall into that category. But these are not static visions. They do evolve, and you can find all sorts of flavors of perspective even within these visions. So anyway, let me just share one with you. A couple of points really about the war in Ukraine and the difference that it's made. I think it's true to say, first of all, it has put new life, new energy into a sort of activist vision, an internationalist vision, if you like, but an activist vision of American engagement in the world. Emma is obviously closer to this sitting in Washington than I am sitting here in Brussels, but I think it's fair to say that the war in Ukraine, the response to Russia, the support for Ukraine, certainly the military support for Ukraine, is perhaps one of the few points of relative bipartisan consensus in Washington these days. There are not too many of those. In a sense, this is held up, I think, quite well. And the United States, of course, has done a tremendous amount, especially in terms of military support and even the delivery of support that's come from others. And that's terribly important. I don't see necessarily too much debate about that aspect of it. Where I think it becomes rougher is on the question of economic support for Ukraine and reconstruction for Ukraine. People talk about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, for example, which is very much embedded in this vision you wanted me to talk about. But there I think it gets much tougher. And the issue of burden sharing, which is already very much on the table, I think is much more pointed when it comes to the question of economic reconstruction and what Europe is doing or not doing. in general, clearly the burden sharing debate is a long-standing one for the United States, and it's bipartisan actually. And the war has just cast this in much sort of more practical terms. I think that's true on the European side of the equation too. And I think you have in fact, as a result, a sort of window here, at least with this administration, of relative tolerance for a much more autonomous European policy, if that means Europe spending more and doing more. So the second point I would make is that I think this war combines in an interesting way with the vision and the sort of composition of the Biden administration when it comes to foreign policy. Biden himself is probably the most foreign policy oriented president we've had since the elder Bush, George H.W. Bush, I would say. And he's also very Atlanticist. This is also true of the people in his entourage. It's true of the key policymakers, even if they're dealing with other areas, with Asia or other places. Their formation has tended to be very Atlanticist. And that, I think, does shape their worldview and obviously their perspective on the conflict. But a couple of other things in this context. One is that I think this administration, and it is consistent with this vision that you're asking me to discuss, not only takes Europe seriously, but takes European institutions seriously. NATO, of course, but the European Union is taken seriously as an interlocutor. That's not always been the case for any recent American administration. But on the question of sanctions, for example, export controls, the European Union has been seen in its own right as a key partner. And I think that's quite significant. Third point I would make is that there obviously are some questions here that are open questions that we need to discuss that are not so simple. It's clear that there is an ideological side to this, the intellectual debate, but also the policy at the moment, focusing on this question of democracy versus autocracy and so on. I would say that even among those who might talk about themselves as sort of liberal internationalists, there is some skepticism about this in many quarters. About how far this takes you in sort of ordering a foreign policy towards the world as a whole, and a question of whether this is really a durable vision. Clearly, it's something that matters to the administration. It becomes much more complicated when you're talking about China and the Asia-Pacific region. It also becomes much more complicated, finally, I think, when you talk about the global South. I think many, I include myself in this, would say that much of the global South, key partners in many respects for the United States, simply are not buying this idea of a looming ideological confrontation between democracies and autocracies. That it's simply too simple by half. And even if they share the legal and ethical concerns about Russian behavior, which is largely true for places like India or Brazil or South Africa, they are not so convinced about the ideological side of this. And you see as a result of that a kind of functional non-alignment on things like sanctions that the US is simply going to have to contend with. And if final, I would just end with this, and you already hinted at it, there is a basic tension between this more activist vision and the costs of that in terms of attention and resources, and the obvious need for reinvestment in the American economy, in American infrastructure, in healthcare and education, all these things which really are undercapitalized. And for any administration, whatever the party, that's going to be a huge distraction for the future, and it's going to set up tensions of kind of economic nationalist kinds across the Atlantic and also with other partners, and you see that already. So it's a story about sort of political security convergence on the one hand with key partners, but also growing tensions, I would say, when it comes to other aspects of our international relationship, especially the economic. So let me stop with that, Laurence, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Hopefully we get to hear a bit more of you from you later. And let us switch to Emma. Emma, hello. Good morning. I hope you're doing okay.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry I cannot be there with you in person. Apparently, COVID continues to be a thing in 2022. So let me, I guess, respond to some of Ian's comments and talk just a little bit about where this debate on foreign policy is in Washington at the moment. So one of the features that I think has been really notable in DC foreign policy debates over the last, let's say, 5 years or so is really quite a strong emerging critique of the bipartisan consensus on US foreign policy, pushing against the overreach of kind of America's post-Cold War foreign policy. And there's a few big reasons for this. So one, rather obviously, was the failures of the global war on terror, right? We saw Afghanistan, the withdrawal a few years ago, but prior to that, 20 years of failing to achieve those objectives in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and elsewhere, I think bred skepticism, both in sort of the American public, which became increasingly war-weary, but also among many analysts, many younger folks working on foreign policy. Couple that with the rise of Trump, the growing multipolarity that we see in the world, things getting shaken up. And I think what we had over the last few years was actually an environment in which conversations about whether America was on the right path in foreign policy had actually become quite mainstream. So, 15, 20 years ago, people criticizing the liberal internationalist consensus were right at the margins. That's become a much more mainstream thing in recent years. Now, because this sort of restraint movement has primarily focused on criticism, it draws a very wide tent of folks and has in recent years. So, there's realist academics like me, but there's also people on the anti-war left, people on the paleo-conservative or libertarian right, people that are worried about taxes, people that are worried about the defense budget. And so this is a very broad tent. And the one thing that they mostly agreed on was on ending the war on terror. They may have had differences of opinion on things like arms control, defense spending overall, the role of US alliances, but that was mostly subsumed under conversations about ending the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what we've seen in the last year, I think, is that the war in Ukraine has shaken things up quite substantially because, this is a very different conflict. This is obviously a war that on Ukraine's part is entirely justified, a war of self-defense against an aggressor. It has fractured apart this sort of critical camp on US foreign policy a little. Based on whether people within that consensus or whether people within that camp value sort of US national interest as their primary objective, or whether they have a more internationalist anti-war approach, how important people think values or democracy are. So I'd say that most people within the restraint camp think that the US is right to give at least some aid to Ukraine to help them fight back against Russia. But there are significant differences, I think, in how far people think that we should go. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that right now you might find more points of commonality between sort of realists like me and, conservative China hawks who want to turn US foreign policy away from Europe and focus on Asia. You might actually find more points of commonality there between those groups than you do between sort of the realists and the progressives who argue that, the US should do everything it possibly can to help Ukraine win. So there's these internal tensions. But despite all of that, and I think this is the key point I want to make here, I think despite that, it's really notable that the concrete response from the administration has actually been extremely realist in general. It's been very restrained in general. Supporting Ukraine, yes, but limiting the types and kinds of weapons that are being sent, being very clearly focused on preventing escalation, maintaining lines of communication to Moscow. This is effectively the mainstream view on how the US should be aiding Ukraine. And it is, in fact, I think, where many realists or restrainers actually are. So it's interesting how that consensus has become part of the mainstream. And I think, this is something that is not being discussed that much yet, but it's also, I think, notable how many aspects of that realist critique of US foreign policy or of liberal internationalism have actually been to some extent borne out by the war in Ukraine. There's the entire debate about NATO expansion, which, we really probably don't want to get into here. But clearly, NATO expansion played a role in leading us towards this conflict, even if it wasn't the precipitating factor. And I think in particular, we see that, the US approach to the world after the Cold War, liberal internationalism that sort of viewed the whole world as America's sphere of influence, that America had substantial influence everywhere, that we could kind of achieve whatever we wanted. That is no longer the case, that there are limits to what America can achieve, particularly in difficult cases like Ukraine, and that in this shift that we are seeing in the international system towards multipolarity, US foreign policy might have to be slightly more restrained. So I think even though that's not the narrative we're hearing, that is actually some of the reality that we're seeing. The underlying trends, I think, continue to express some skepticism about a very outward-focused, very activist US foreign policy. We see in polling that Americans very clearly want increased burden sharing. They want Europeans to contribute more in Ukraine. There's a growing sort of a groundswell of opinion, particularly I think on the conservative right, that's arguing that Europe isn't contributing enough in this conflict. And even at the administration level, as Ian notes, right, the Biden administration is willing to engage with Europe on issues of European defense, and that's a noted change from past administrations. So, I think we are in a place where, even though this debate that we've been seeing between sort of realists and liberal internationalists, it's not playing out in public in the same way that we have been seeing in recent years over the war on terror, but it is still very much shaping the future of US foreign policy. And I think that the last thing I'll call attention to here is, many people might respond to me and say, well, the administration's language is firmly liberal internationalist, the national security strategy is extremely forward-leaning. I think that's true. It's a wholehearted embrace of liberal internationalism. In practice, that's not actually how the administration has been pursuing its foreign policy, and in particular, not how they've been pursuing Ukraine policy. So I think this is a live debate, but I think it would be wrong to assume that some of these criticisms of US foreign policy have simply been shut out by the war in Ukraine. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Emma. It was very interesting. Let me just add something I forgot to say when we started. People online, if you want to write questions in the Q&A, for the Q&A session we'll have later with the audience, please do. And with that, I'm turning to Jacques Rupnik. So Jacques, what are Eastern European countries, Central European countries expecting from the United States at this point?
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. What do they expect? Well, in war times, they expect the confirmation of what they were always hoping for from America. The American prism for the countries of East Central Europe, and that goes back to the immediate post-Cold War period. And their effort to join NATO that is the paramount security guarantee you expect. It just so happens that in the context of the Ukrainian war, this got confirmed, reinforced, and it all goes back to their reading of Russia. Going back to old history, but going back to the 1990s. I remember doing an interview with Václav Havel and an interview with Manfred Werner, who was the Secretary General of NATO at the time. And they had two different, I mean, you can find them both in Politique Internationale. They had different readings of Russia. Manfred Werner was saying, well, where is the threat? You know, Russia is down, if not completely out. There is no Russian threat. There is no need for rushing with expansion. And Václav Havel was basically saying, well, this is what Russia is now, but we don't know what it's going to be like in 10 or 20 years. And NATO is our insurance policy. And why NATO? Because in NATO, the key player is the United States. So I would say this war in Ukraine is the NATO moment and therefore the US moment from the point of view of the countries of East Central Europe. So that has a security prism. I will also say something about it. This is a view shared or supported by a large part of the public opinion. This is not just a bunch of elites or people sitting in think tanks. And thirdly, that they are prepared to actually invest, so to speak, in that relationship, and that touches certain economic issues and the defense procurement issues and such. And I will conclude in relativizing some of these sort of very one-sided assumptions I've just mentioned. On the first issue, I don't think I have to spell it a long time. On Russia, we told you so. We knew this was Russia. They are basically an imperialist power. They are a threat, and now this has been confirmed. And secondly, it has been confirmed that facing that threat, only NATO and the United States is the security guarantee. Incidentally, that goes back to the debate at the time of NATO enlargement. If you take NATO enlargement, that was 1999, I remember the discussions then, including with Ron Asmus, who was the main promoter in America of that enlargement, of that NATO expansion. Rasmus and Larrabee, who was at Rand Corporation at the time, and Ron Asmus, who had joined Madeleine Albright's team at the State Department. The view was following then. The debate was roughly following. From the American point of view, NATO must go out of area or out of business. Europe is no longer the only agenda. There is no immediate imminent threat. We were in the 1990s. Remember, that was still Yeltsin time. And out of area, yes, there are new challenges. So out of area or out of business. The French position was, we must build a European defense identity, etc., etc. You know the familiar tune. And the Central European story was, we want old NATO. And everybody thought, well, you know, you are still lagging behind, etc. And what was old NATO? It's the one that basically Lord Ismay defined at its creation. What is NATO for? Keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was what NATO was for. And that, from a Polish point of view today, is just what we need. I hope this is that everybody understands. I'm trying to reflect the views of those countries, that this is not necessarily me endorsing everything, every statement that Polish and other politicians make. But they feel vindicated in their reading of Russia and in what they thought NATO should be for. So that is, I think, very important, and therefore, related to that, there are very strong misgivings, to put it mildly, about France and Germany in that context. France with its concept of strategic autonomy, that basically in East Central Europe today, in the context of the Ukrainian war, this is a non-starter. It's very hard to start a discussion on that. You know? So I can go back to that in the discussion, but basically it is seen as a kind of code word for weakening NATO and therefore US presence in Europe. So this is the last thing they want at this point. On Germany, this is because Germany has been wrong on Russia. This is because Germany, etc., has misread the energy question and a number of others. And if you read some of the Polish statements today, I mean, Kaczynski in particular, they are almost as strongly anti-German as they are anti-Russian. It is quite staggering. These are the historical, of course, two main enemies of Poland, but you would have thought, you know, you have Polish politics used to be divided about who thought the main enemy was Russia or the main enemy was Germany. No, now you ask Kaczynski, he says both. So this is, you are in the midst of a war, you are supporting Ukraine, and at the same time, you are asking Germany reparations for World War II. One war leads you to another one. So this is the state of mind, supported by public opinion. I mean, I will not inflict, I don't think I have much time, but if you ask people, you know, does the US play a positive role in international affairs? And there's this big surveys that you are familiar with, you know, the transatlantic, what is it called? Transatlantic Trends. Okay, so you have read it, so I don't have to. But, you know, you have that Poland, #1 country, not just in Europe, in the world, thinking that US plays that positive role, followed by Lithuania and a few others. And just to quote the Polish Minister of Defense, US leadership in assuring deterrence, etc., remains paramount, etc., etc. You have dozens of statements like that. So US equals security equals NATO, and this is widely shared even in the public opinion across the board. There are, I will come to it at the end, there are differences between countries and shouldn't be seen as a bloc. There is these perceptions and attitudes towards the United States, translate them into policies. This morning there was a panel on the trade issues, economic issues. Well, the last thing East Central Europeans would want is, in this context where security is paramount, a trade issue or trade difference with the United States to weaken the relationship. So they will not be exactly very engaging in wanting to have a serious discussion, un bras de fer, as the French would say, with the US over the trade issue. Similarly, if you know, they vote with their feet, or rather with their checkbook, if you talk about defense procurement, well, you want American guarantee for your security, buy American. And this is what Florence Parly, the former French defense minister, called, you know, there is Article 5 in NATO, but I didn't know there was Article F115. Well, the Article 115 is maybe not in the treaty, but it is certainly in the minds, and it is implemented. So I mean, you have seen it recently, you know, they turned down French helicopters, they turned down German tanks, and they're buying American and even Korean, as the Poles have done recently. They prefer buy Korean tanks rather than getting them from Germany or elsewhere. And I don't have time about the recent squabble about the Patriots when the Germans offered the use of the Patriots to be manned by Germans. Well, no, not the German. Germans are not needed to do so. So investing in defense procurement on the American side. Then there is the issue that has been raised about liberal internationalism and the democracy, the framing of this war, democracy versus autocracy. Well, that is something that suits the Central Europeans. That is very much the way they tend to see this war. Not only, of course, there is Russian imperialism, historically rooted, etc., but there is this issue of democracy versus autocracy. That fits with the Biden administration rhetoric to some extent, but the Biden administration on the democracy question was a global proposition. That was about China, it was about Russia, it was about Iran, it was a global proposition. And it had implications for Eastern Europe as well in some way. In this context, you have the above mentioned international powers, but suddenly Poland gets away with murder, so to speak, or gets away with a very curious practice of democracy and the rule of law. So basically, America, given Poland's strategic place in the Western effort vis-à-vis the war in Ukraine, it became key country, incontournable, and therefore you drop the democracy issue. The American ambassador, American ambassador in Poland, Brzezinski, the son of Zbigniew Brzezinski, basically said as much. There is a strategic priority right now. We will see to other issues later. And that suits very much the current peace government. But should I say that the Kaczynski government was very much a pro-Trump government. They loved Donald Trump and they welcomed him in Warsaw. And President Duda, actually, when Biden was elected, President Duda very late and slowly congratulated Biden on his campaign, not on his victory, on his campaign, and they waited to the last moment to see if by chance the result will not be overturned. They were very much praying for Trump. They are Trumpists. and they have to put up with Biden, but since Biden is re-engaging America and Europe, well, that's exactly what they wanted. So let's discuss democracy later. Is a conclusion. I think my time has run out. I see in the way you look at me. Perhaps I will simply say at the end that yes, Poland, the Baltic countries. In particular, the Czech government, actually the present Czech government, has very much aligned itself in the Polish position, with one big difference, of course, is that the Polish position is stridently pro-American, but also extremely Eurosceptic. Not only they don't like strategic autonomy, but it's a Eurosceptic government. So it's not abiding by liberal democracy inside, but it's Eurosceptic in its attitude towards European integration. This is not quite the case of the Czech government, which would be more Euro-pragmatic. You have big differences, but the main difference is, of course, with Hungary, the country that has given, so to speak, the benefit of the doubt to Vladimir Putin and his war in Ukraine. And they therefore get the criticism and from Europe and from America and have put themselves in this Putin-esque corner, but that is of their own making. And there are differences. I could continue if I had the time. If you look at public opinion, for instance, surveys in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, former Czechoslovakia, it used to be one country. Well, on the whole, again, I'm summarizing crudely, the Czechs support Ukraine and have a very, very hostile view of Russia. You have a very different view in Slovakia, where almost half of the people think, the Russians have a point. So that's public opinion. So there you have differences between decision makers and the public opinion. But basically what I would say at the end is that what the war has done, it has reinforced trends that were there present all the way. I mentioned about the NATO enlargement. The reasons they wanted to join NATO is because of the US security guarantee. They would not have put any faith in any kind of European guarantee provided by whom? By Germany? By France? No. So America is the only game in town. And it brings me back to not only differences between Eastern and Western Europe in this attitude towards the United States, it goes back to another war, the war in Iraq. Remember old Europe, new Europe? That was the way Donald Rumsfeld then defined the differences, who are the most loyal supporters of the United States at the time. And indeed, certain East Central Europeans were prepared to follow America in the Mesopotamian desert, not because they believed that they would turn it into a democratic, flourishing democracy, but because they wanted an insurance policy for their own security motives. I find, therefore, a certain continuity in that kind of thinking. The only security you can guarantee you will get is from America and from nowhere else. One big difference, and I finish with that, is that at the time, the Americans encouraged a European divide or European differences. Old Europe, new Europe. And indeed, at that time, the Bush administration made a European divide into a transatlantic virtue. Whereas the current administration, on the contrary, plays down these differences, tries to accommodate all of these point of views, and the recent visit of Macron actually in the United States only confirms that. Yes, Biden went to Poland and said Poland was wonderful and doing a great job in supporting Ukraine, and welcome France as his greatest and closest ally, etc. And that's a very different message coming from the White House from the one we had 20 years ago during the Iraq War.
Thank you, Jacques. We'll get back to the question of Hungary. I believe that it's very, very interesting. But let's turn to the view from France.
Thank you very much, Laurence. So I'm Manuel Lafont. I'm the head of CAPS, the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy of the French MFA. That's the policy planning. And my role includes that what we say does not necessarily represent French official positions. So I just want to make that clear at the beginning. I have 3 points. And the first one is on the general context in which I think this US debate, foreign policy debate is happening, which is the fact that there is this trend of the end of what used to be the bipartisan consensus on foreign policy in most Western democracies. Sometimes you see that consensus ending because of domestic drivers. You have Brexit in the UK, you have Trump in the US. Sometimes you have international drivers. In the US, it's China. In Germany, it's maybe more Russia these days. Sometimes you have both. And even when it's domestic driver, it's not just populism. And in a way that the end of this consensus, of what used to be a consensus, brings us back to a belated discussion that started after the end of the Cold War on what our role is in the world for each of these respective countries. But just we are having this debate under pressure very differently from where we were 25, 30 years ago. Yet there is also a very big difference, which is that the so-called international liberal order is these days in a very different position place than it was where it was after the end of the Cold War. It's not just that you have some key rules that are being blatantly violated. It's also that there's more generally a very different outlook towards liberalism, including within these Western democracies. Free trade is one of the most visible examples, but I don't think it's the only one. Of course, not everybody thinks in terms of international liberal order, which is a very American expression. The German usually prefer the rules-based world order. In France, we usually refer to the multilateral order, which probably insists not just on the importance of rules, but also on the importance of collective action and some kind of regulation. But nonetheless, that general situation of the international order plays a role. That kind of consensus is also missing in France, certainly. It's maybe not that visible when you look at the actual foreign policy of the most recent presidents, but it's very visible during presidential campaign debates, both in 2017 and in 2022. And there is probably one thing on which there was always a debate in France, which is the relation with the US. But that debate on the relation with the US has exacerbated with the changing course, if I can say, of the US foreign policy. You had Clinton, then you had Bush, then you had Obama, then Trump, then Biden. And it's not just a pendulum between two partisan nuances. It's really a lot of big differences between each of them. And so there is an impact of the US foreign policy debate, not just because of the terms of the debate, which obviously have a kind of intellectual influence in Europe, but also because what is seen as the trajectory of the US is part of what is going to be the debate in Europe. And I think that seen from France, at least seen from where I sit, the debate is not just between restraints or activism. It's also about what kind of attitude will the US adopt vis-à-vis international responsibilities in general and vis-à-vis allies and partners. That means when the US is active, are they going to be unilateral and nationalistic or not? My second point is how do you, which is kind of what Emma did, how do you check that debate against delivery, against the reality of the foreign policy that we see, especially in the case of the response to the war in Ukraine? And that's interesting because I think restraints, just as internationalism, can mean very different things depending on who you talk to or who is talking. Right now, I'd rather say, but I can have that discussion with Emma in the Q&A also and others, that the administration is cautious and strategic more than restrained, specifically speaking. But rather than playing on words, what I think is important is that there is clearly no abandonment of Europe by the US. There is this determination that the US will support Ukraine as long as Ukrainian needs it. And there is a big role of coordination with ally, of transatlantic coordination and broader coordination, for instance, G7, etc. And sanctions are probably the most visible part of that coordination and how it happened. But the debate is also interesting because we see that there is no US consensus and that this consensus is missing for various reasons. You have people thinking in terms of strategic restraint, but you have also those who argue in terms of cost, especially at a time of economic difficulties and tension. You have those who think in terms of burden sharing, which is a way to think about cost more at the international level than about domestic level. You have the China hoax. And clearly, one part of the US foreign policy debate after Ukraine is a debate about China. It's the invasion of Ukraine has triggered a more insistent debate of a potential invasion of Taiwan, which includes the question about what the US can expect from the Europeans. And last on that point, the current commitment of the US administration towards Europe won't last forever. And that's not just because there's this big China focus at the end of their strategic horizon, and the horizon might not be that far from 2022, but also because there's a presidential election in 2 years, and not everybody is convinced that Biden wants to go to the election with the war still going on. And even if you skip that kind of electoral deadline, as I think Ian said, Biden is probably a very, the kind of character of internationalist and transatlanticist character that you have with Biden, you will see less and less of them with future US leaders. Another part of that check against delivery part of the analysis of the debate is the debate on how much are Europeans doing for Ukraine. Well, first, Europeans are not doing so bad, contrary to what some people say. Everybody seems to refer to the Kiel Institute figures. So if you refer to the latest Kiel Institute figures, actually there is 52 billion euros given by the EU and member states in military, financial and humanitarian commitments to Ukraine. And that's more than what the US has given so far. It's not very hugely different. It's a bit less than 50 billion euros for the US, but it shows that Europeans are not doing so bad. Second, you need to add costs, the costs that come with the war, which are not really balanced in the way they are supported by both sides of the Atlantic. The disruption of trade is much bigger for Europeans. The impact of the energy transition and the fact that we are buying expensive LNG, sometimes from the US, makes also part of the equation, the taking in of refugees. And the last part of that debate on how do we do with Ukraine and what we are doing collectively for Ukraine is what's next. And that's my third point. What's the long-term view and the US trajectory? Well, first, there is this China focus. And if you look at the national security strategy, the US goal is allegedly to outcompete China. I'm not sure that's the right way to put it, if I can venture into this discussion, not just because of what you could consider as French traditional concern against bloc-to-bloc logic and self-fulfilling prophecies, but because this leads to outcompeting China happening at the expense of Europeans or Indo-Pacific allies. If you look at the Chips and Science Act, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's exactly what Jacques was referring to with the fact that some EU members are not really willing to tell the Americans right now that there are some economic tensions due to their economic policy, but these tensions do exist and they have consequences, and they have not just economic consequence for European countries right now at a time of economic difficulties, but they also have political consequences in the Indo-Pacific region, including for staunch allies like South Korea or Japan, but also for kind of third countries who don't want to make a choice between China and the US. Second, Europe, I think what is needed is, I'm very happy to hear from both Jan and Emma that it's pretty obvious that Europeans should do more. I think some Europeans might want to hear this coming from Americans more. What is needed is probably more outspoken and unambiguous support for European investment in defense and in global outlook. I don't think those who need to be convinced are the French. But Jacques mentioned the paradox about strategic autonomy at a time when what the EU does has a lot to do with strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. That's what we do with defense trade instruments. That's what we do with DMA and DSA and digital issues. That's what we do in energy transition. But everybody trashes the concept or the word, the expression itself. But it's also the paradox that one interpretation of the war seems to be that it's now clear that there is no solution without the US, whereas the US insists that Europeans need to be able to do more by themselves and for themselves. And I think that's a really important part. And third, that there's the vision of the international order. If you look at the foreign policy debate these days in DC, it's very striking to me, especially in think tanks, that you have Asia specialists who look at what China does in the Asia region, the Pacific region, maybe the Indo-Pacific region writ large, but that's very much what they focus on. And you have Europe specialists who are very much focused on NATO and TTIP and how to revive trade negotiations, but you miss that kind of transatlantic discussion about the rest of the world. Or you need the Asia-Pacific discussion about how you work with the rest of the world on China. And so this idea of the international order, I think, is really important. The order will not stay the same. Even if Ukraine does win the war, it's necessary to rethink the structure, the instruments, the substance of multilateral public policies. You need to strengthen and actualize, materialize the support for the key principles and fundamental rules of the UN Charter. And it's important that, if it's important that the national security strategy focuses less on democracies against authoritarian power, now it focuses more on the importance of revisionist strategy. That consensus on the key principles of the order won't hold if we, and together Americans and Europeans have a role to play, don't achieve concrete results in coping with global challenges, and if we don't respond to developing countries' needs and priorities.
Well, you made a plan in 3 parts and 3 subparts, which is very academic of you. Thank you. I understand that Ian Lesser has to leave soon, but maybe he still has a few minutes to react to what the other 3 have said. Is Ian still there?
I'm here.
Okay. Well, the floor is yours for as long as you like.
And I do apologize for having to rush off. I mean, a lot of much that I agree with. I mean, frankly, you framed this in a way that was meant to create a bit of an intellectual tension between these various perspectives. But in fact, I think you heard a lot of convergence. I think that, the basic point is that, and Emma underscored this, but I think also Manuel in other ways, that, you can't be too sort of much of a purist about these visions these days. The world is producing all kinds of risks and developments that you simply, that don't necessarily conform to neat ideas about global order. And, we had a couple of decades where, there were things going wrong for sure, but you didn't have this kind of structural challenges to the global order that we see today. And so it's a different kind of debate, and it's inevitably going to be a much more practical one. I think you see that in a lot of the American approach to the war in Ukraine, the focus on, yes, very complete support for Ukraine, but with some limits, and also a very clear awareness, I think, that the longer this goes on, the accumulated risk of something going wrong, just as there's accumulated risk of something going wrong over Taiwan or in the South China Sea with China, is not irrelevant. And so, this focus on escalation and risk reduction and strategic stability is still, I think, inevitably there for a country like the United States and others. There is an interesting question here that I think is raised by all of us about, the looming, this sort of strategic focus on China. I mean, this, of course, was already very much on the agenda for years, but there was, I think, especially in Europe, an assumption that, well, perhaps this thing is just going to go slowly. That if we're coming to the end of a 100-year American pivot to Europe, that's going to be a slow adjustment in which Europeans are able to accommodate, changes in American strategy and force posture and in different ways. The idea that you might have to do this in weeks or months rather than years or decades is, I think, sort of profoundly disturbing to a lot of the strategic calculus on both sides of the Atlantic, but it could easily happen. So I think that's something we need to sort of price into this as well. I think this point about, are the sort of internationalists, Atlanticists, Europeanists in American policymaking disappearing? Are they a kind of vanishing breed? Well, maybe. I think it's also true in a sense for the public. Transatlantic trends was mentioned, which we do. For many years, we asked a question of Americans and Europeans about whether they thought that relations across the Atlantic or relations in Asia were more important to them, to their daily life. And what was very clear, by the way, Europeans always, no matter their age, basically said the Atlantic mattered more. But for Americans, the younger you were, the more likely you were to say, no, it's increasingly about Asia. And that isn't necessarily positive or negative. It's just simply, the notion that somehow Asia as an element on the scene affecting their own interests was growing and growing. And that seems to be a structural thing that we're all going to have to take account of. Just a final comment, maybe. Again, it plays into the sort of political forces. Emma underscored this, but also, Jacques mentioned it in different ways. Populists on the right and on the left, challengers of this kind of, elite strategic class thinking and so on. Even Obama used to talk about the blob in Washington. There is out there, especially on the left and on the right, this idea that there's a struggle against these elites and their projects, and their projects include things like alliances and trade agreements and arms control agreements and things like that. And so it's not just about the people; it's also, I would say, about the structure. And if it's true that people like me are a vanishing breed, we have a different world coming.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to open the floor to questions, but before we do, I just ask one to Emma. So, Emma, you've heard Jacques describe the very strong expectations from Eastern European countries towards the United States. Manuel also mentioned Taiwan and China. So, from the view of people who want a more restrained foreign policy from the United States, what would you have to say on those two issues? What should the US do if China invades Taiwan, to be very blunt? And what would you say to Baltic states and Poland? Thank you. I know it's a very easy. No, not easy. No, it's a very blunt questions, but there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, they are very blunt questions. What I would say is there are certainly people who would argue that, if Russia were to attack the Baltic states, that the US shouldn't intervene. That's a very, very small proportion of people. I would say that even most mainstream realists and restrainers tend to maintain, that there is some role for NATO, that the US should play some role in NATO, etc. So I don't think that's a debate that's being had really at all. I think, the Biden administration's been extremely clear about, drawing this bright red line around NATO. And again, I think that's one area where, despite the rhetoric, actually what they're doing in practice does look like what a lot of those of us who sort of argue for more realism in foreign policy have actually argued. The Taiwan question, though, is a totally different thing. That is a live debate in Washington. And, we're seeing, I would say that there are people who are increasingly coming down on the notion that to defend the United States interests in Asia, we must maintain Taiwan, right? So there is a school of thought that, if we cannot keep Taiwan independent of China, then that has military consequences that make life much harder for the US elsewhere in Asia. And so we've seen folks like Elbridge Colby make that argument. But then I think there's another school of thought, and this is where some people who are perhaps not nominally realists or restrainers, but are somewhat aligned, have come out. So we've seen people like Charlie Glazer or Patrick Porter effectively make the argument that Taiwan is important and the US should help it to defend itself, but that we are more likely to start a war by pushing strongly on Taiwan than we are to actually prevent one. And I think that for myself, that's where I am. So in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which I do think is still relatively unlikely, it's not clear to me that the US should intervene. Because if the argument is that we're intervening now in order to prevent a future war, we're going to fight a war today, that to me does not seem to be a particularly compelling logic. But as I say, this, unlike the question of NATO members and Russia, the Taiwan question, I think, is a very much open debate in Washington.
Thank you. That was a very clear answer to my question. So thank you very much. Let me open the floor to questions if there are. Axel, of course. Oh, pardon. Well, let's start with Celia. The microphone is getting to you. If it works, it doesn't work, does it? Good grief. Please.
Because the panel is talking about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the foreign policy debate, there's a major foreign policy debate that's happening both in Washington, in France, and in other places, which is the debate of what to do with Russia long term, what to do to end this war. Should all Western leaders make an effort to get Russia to negotiate or get Ukraine to negotiate, and at which point? And what to do with Russia long term in terms of integrating it in Europe's security architecture, for example. So I want to ask all three remaining panelists, because they have different perspective, what is their view of that debate? And to Manuel in particular, how should we interpret Macron's latest position on security guarantees for Russia, and potentially how this proposal is highly unpopular, for example, in Poland, obviously, but not necessarily also reflects part of the foreign policy debate in DC, but not entirely.
Okay, so I'm repeating the question for Emma. Celia Belin, who was on the panel this morning, is asking about what we should do about Russia long-term. What sort of security architecture we should build in Europe after the war? Is it too early to discuss it? Is it self-defeating to discuss it as early as now? And what are the view of the three panelists on this? But maybe we can start with Jacques. Non, enfin, si ça vous va.
Sorry. What to do with Russia? Yes. Again, if you ask the question from, sorry, maybe you should start with Manuel. I will have a drink in the meantime.
Manuel, merci.
So first, it's really funny how, depending on who the messenger is, the message is perceived. I think before Macron made his comments, you also had Biden comment who said that now he was willing to talk to Putin under some conditions, and I didn't see the kind of reactions that we had when Macron says he speaks to Putin, or when Scholz say he speaks to Putin, and we don't have these reactions when Zelensky or the Ukrainian authorities say that at some point, if there is a need for negotiation, they are willing to negotiate. Zelensky has put forward a 10-point peace plan, which seems to indicate that he has something in view which is different than just prevailing militarily and stopping, limiting his policy at that. Of course, it doesn't mean that negotiation have to happen without conditions and be totally open in terms of what the outcome would be, etc. In terms of the security architecture, I think it's interesting to think of the difference between a security architecture in Europe or in the North Atlantic region without Russia or against Russia. My own anticipation of what is going to happen is that whichever the conditions under which hostilities stop in Ukraine, there will be deep strategic instability in the relationship between Europe and Russia. not just at the Ukrainian border, whether you have occupied territories or not, but you have Belarus, you have the Baltic area, you have the Black Sea, you have the Arctic, you have Syria, you have Western Africa and the Sahel. This is all, you have space, you have cyber, you have manipulation of information. This is all going to stay. It's not going to disappear. So it makes sense to have a security architecture that does take that new fact into account. And basically, the European political community and the idea that this big pan-European continental scale initiative of Europeans working together, including on issues of defense and security, that's the way the French see it, and French authorities have tried to, what French authorities have tried to push. This is drawing the lessons of the fact that you need some kind of architecture that is that takes into account this situation. Does it mean that you can't have any kind of security discussion or relation with Russia? Of course, no, it doesn't. If you think of New Start, I don't think the US administration idea is that New Start should be dropped just because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And if there's a way to prolong New Start or make it better, the US are going to seize that opportunity. And so if you think in terms of security guarantees, I don't think there is any idea that it's for France or any other NATO country, for that matter, to provide positive security guarantees to Russia. But I think that if you think of New Starts or rules of the game like the UN Charter principle, OSCE principles, Paris Charter principles as security guarantee, if you think of the kind of statements made by the P5 on why nuclear war cannot be won, and there is a need for cooperation between nuclear powers to avoid nuclear incidents and accidental nuclear contingencies. That makes totally sense, not just to French policy planners, I guess.
Just apologies for my voice. All the things that have been mentioned by Manuel, I think need to talk to Russia, not just about Ukraine, but also about, I don't know, Baltic Sea, Black Sea, cyber, what have you. There's a long range of European security issues. That's, I think nobody would dispute that. The question is when. And the countries of East Central Europe, I'm just trying to reflect what their thinking is. Not now. You talk to Russians after the war. And this is where perhaps the difference, again. And that brings us to the other issue, which is war aims. Apologies. What are the war aims? And I think the Central European point of view would be closer to the what the American Secretary of Defense stated when he came to Poland at the end of April. And he basically said the aim is not just to get the Russians out of Ukraine, but to weaken Russia lastingly for a long time, so that Russia would not be for a long time in a position to pose a new threat security threat in Europe. That is what he said about the American war aims should be. That is very much the position. So since our subject is America, there would be much closer to this view in America. Now, perhaps you will tell me there are others in America who may be thinking even in the administration differently. But that is, I think, the view closest to the countries of Central Europe. They also have a different reading, perhaps, about what the sources and the causes of war are, and basically about what Russia is and what is the likely outcome of that war. But that is perhaps not the subject of of our discussion today. They do not think that the Russia that will come out of this war will be the Russia that we had before. So the thinking that we just go back to a discussion with Russia about European security as if this incident had not happened, entre parenthèses, this will not happen, no. That they believe also Russia should be defeated lastingly. And there are all sorts of discussions going on, and including in America. I've just been in when I was in a conference in the US with Tim Snyder, basically people discussing the breakup of Russia. It's unlikely not only that Putin could stay in power, but that the country as such would hold together. Okay, these are the discussions that are going on in certain circles in America, including circles of people who are not exactly warmongers. I mean, Tim Snyder was the biggest opponent of the Bush administration, the Iraq War, and all those things like that, but very strongly committed to the idea that you will not rebuild a new security order in Europe with the Russia as it is.
Well, let's turn to Emma and see. She said, Emma, you said earlier that defense of Europe through NATO was par for the course amongst all schools of thought in America. What are your views, or what do you think the might of Russia should become? How should it be framed in future years?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, let me clarify that, because I don't think I would say it's par for the course necessarily. I would say that among those who are engaged actively in these debates in the intellectual community, there are not many that would suggest the US just withdraw from NATO. But as we have seen in the last few years, there are political currents and political tendencies that might well do that. Donald Trump apparently tried to do so. There are people within the Republican base that might do so. So again, I would not perhaps put that quite in as strong terms as I may have earlier. In terms of the Russia question, I think it's actually helpful to go back and think about what it was the Biden administration actually wanted to do with Russia prior to all of this. So they effectively tried to park Russia to focus on China. The idea was you have some strategic stability talks with Putin that winds down some of the tensions in Eastern Europe. The US can pull some troops back from there, and Russia's not a big problem. We can focus on China, and that was the theory. I mean, it was obviously a very flawed theory, but that was the idea. And I do think in general that is, the administration would still like to switch its attention, pull back from China and focus on Russia, pull back from Russia and focus on China. We hear this constantly in discussions about export controls and what the US should be doing in the Indo-Pacific and trade deals. And, so there is that undercurrent within the Biden administration. From my point of view, I do think that the best way to actually do that as a strategy would be to try and resolve this conflict in a way that also resolves some of those bigger questions about European security architecture, that tries to make a more secure peace in Europe that doesn't just flare up into a new war. But as Jacques notes, that's going to be an extremely hard political sell in Washington. That's simply not where the discussions among the foreign policy elite in Washington are. Those discussions are primarily about things like how to weaken Russia long term, how to add more sanctions, how many troops the US should add in Eastern Europe. And we see these discussions about Russia as a persistent threat. And so, as much as it's not something I would want to do, but I suspect that the path of least resistance here is going to be some kind of costly US commitment to Eastern Europe. You hear the administration talking about phasing of conflict or swinging troops from Europe to Asia in the case of conflict. And so it seems like they are trying to, basically move away from that construct of they're going to focus on Asia and ignore Russia, and they're going to stay focused on Russia for the long term. Then to my sort of original point, the big question is future administrations. Will future administrations actually sustain that? And in the future, in the case of a future sort of Trumpian or Trumpian-like administration, it seems to me that actually raises the possibility of a much more sudden US disconnect from Europe to focus on Asia, not something that's planned over a period of time, but something that, you know, if there's a Taiwan contingency, that we actually see the US just leave rather faster than anticipated. So I think, you know, there's this administration and their approach, and then there's the future administrations, and those are very different things.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe we've seen what a Trumpian administration attitude to Europe was a few years ago. I believe the microphone has been réparé, has been fixed. And so if there are questions, John, here, we'll get to you next, Axel.
Thank you. John Seaman from the Center for Asian Studies here at Ifri. My question is primarily for Emma, I guess, and just sort of to carry on this discussion about Russia and the considerations of European strategic autonomy. We'd mentioned a couple of times, Manuel, you'd mentioned that about how there's discussion about how Europeans should do more for Europeans. The US is sort of inciting Europe to do more, to be more present. Europe needs to do more for and by themselves. And yet every time we seem to discuss the notion of strategic autonomy with American counterparts, they're wondering why we don't trust America, or why we want to kick America out of Europe, or this sort of thing. So my question is really about how this notion of strategic autonomy is viewed in Washington in strategic circles, not perhaps by yourself in particular, but also among a lot of your colleagues who try to think more strategically about these questions, and how you understand the concept of strategic autonomy. And if, as you mentioned, there might be a new Trumpian administration or Trump-like administration that suddenly just decides we can't afford to be in Europe anymore, we're going to go to Asia. It's that concern that I would say was really sort of at the origins of this notion of European strategic autonomy with the pivot to Asia. We've been thinking about this for 10 years now. We've been worried about the United States might just decide we can't afford to be in two places at once, and our strategic priority is clearly in Taiwan and not in Poland, for instance. I mean, you can't do without Taiwanese semiconductors, but you can probably do without Poland. If that's the choice, then the choice is rather clear for Washington. So where does that leave Europe? We have to think more strategically about ourselves. And it seems that the US isn't necessarily willing to help us build our own ability to defend ourselves here in Europe, even though rhetorically speaking, that's where we seem to be pushed towards. Thanks.
Emma?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? And the point that the US is basically schizophrenic on the question of European defense, it's not a new one, right? This goes all the way back to Dick Cheney and defense policy planning guidance like 1992, you know, and he there was explicitly arguing that we shouldn't let Europe develop its own independent defense capabilities. And I would say that is a strain that has continued through a lot of these discussions. Europe tends to say that the US tends to say that it wants Europe to do more, but our actions do not necessarily lend themselves to that conclusion. And I'd say that this year has been just another sort of stellar example of that, right? We see, you know, Washington repeatedly saying Europe has to do more, has to spend more, etc. At the same time, right, the Biden administration has effectively committed to keeping 100,000 troops in Europe, you know, in perpetuity. That there is no move to actually sort of make the stakes higher in a way that might actually prompt, you know, European states to start to work together more effectively. So there's this real disconnect between what we say and do. And I would say there's also a real disconnect between the people who work on these issues in Washington, and as you say, sort of in a more intellectual milieu, or who are perhaps better connected with European policy circles, and there's a real disconnect between that and I think how many in sort of the more political space, or even among sort of, you know, if you look at popular polling among the American public, there's a real disconnect between how these two groups think about that. You know, that elite group is sort of understands, I think intellectually understands that there are very good reasons Europe needs to step up on defense, you know, potential pivot to Asia, etc. You know, the US increasingly able to do somewhat less in the world. And they understand all of these, but they also understand the problems, right? Europe's collective action problem, the fact that Europe doesn't have sufficient defense industrial base, all of these problems. And so, you know, I think that group is ambivalent about these questions. But if you look at public polling, and you look at the ways that politicians, particularly on the conservative right, talk about these issues, what you find, I think, is a very strong kind of gut feeling that, you know, that Europe needs to pay its own way, that America is supporting Europe and not getting enough for it. Now, I'm not saying whether I agree with that or not, but that, I think, is where the political discussion is, or the sort of the grassroots discussion. If you put this to people in a poll, that's the kind of response you'll get. And so, you know, even though I think, you know, you talk to folks in Washington, they're a bit more ambivalent about this question of European defense. There are those trends in American politics that I think are very much pushing in this direction. And again, my concern is that, you know, given that where we may end up is not some sort of managed transition, but rather some sort of sudden shift where the US pulls back more than it perhaps intended to.
Thank you. A quick comment by Manuel, and then Axel's question he's been waiting for.
I have comments also on what Jacques said. The idea that you can talk to Russia, but only after the war. First, for instance, right now you have this situation in Zaporizhia about the nuclear plant. You have the IAEA Director General talking to Russia, and I think it's important that we don't wait until the end of the war to have these kind of discussions, and you don't really need to have only the DG of the IAEA to talk to Russian authorities. There were supposed to be arms control talks between Russia and the US. They were put off quite abruptly, but by the Russian side, according to the US. But more importantly than that, actually to end the war, it will take talks. You can't end the war and then talk. And that's including part of why Zelensky has put on the table these 10 points peace proposal. Second, there is this idea indeed that Secretary of Defense Austin mentioned in April about the fact that the goal was to have Russia weakened. But if you look at what Biden says on the issue of the war aims, actually his war goals are about Ukraine, not about Russia. He says he wants a viable and safe and democratic and prosperous Ukraine. Of course, safe against any aggression means something vis-à-vis Russia and how you deter it and how it's going to be able to be a threat or not in the future. But that's, I think, a different framing. And I think that's a good reflection of some of the nuances or differences in the European discussion. And I say in the European discussion more than in European action, because if you look at in terms of sanctions, taking the initiative and pushing for more sanctions against Russia, which is a way to weaken Russia very clearly. I think France has been quite active in terms of assistance to criminal justice investigation, which is not a very light thing when people believe that you don't want to humiliate Putin. The same if you deliver Caesar cannons. It's not really something that you do if you think that the war should not go too far. The fact that there were few initiatives taken to, quite a few initiatives taken to put Russia out of some international organizations. So I think this helps to put things in perspective. On what was just discussed, it's important to understand that I don't think China is just Asia. And if you look at the way China looks at the war in Ukraine, clearly they are looking at it as a precedent from which they can take lessons. And I think that's part of the explanation why this US administration is so committed to the situation in Ukraine. It's not just about Europe or Russia. It's also very much about China. It's not just a sentimental commitment to transatlantic relation. On the why don't Europeans trust the US more, I think it's more lucid to be as candid as Secretary Blinken has been quite a few times, the US Secretary of State, where basically he says, in his speeches, he says, America is back, and I know you are wondering, yes, but for how long? Because you have reasons to ask yourself these questions, and our goal as the current US administration is to make that return of the US on the international stage sustained, etc. But it's easier to square this circle if you have a recognition of the fact that there are some reasons to ask the questions. And that's also why on the European side, the idea that Europeans need to do more is not just Europeans need to do more for Europe. I think parts of the interests of the transatlantic conversation right now is, first, Europeans need to do more for transatlantic security, and it's one of the big elements of the wording of Biden and Macron's discussions. It's how European defense contributes to transatlantic security, but I think it's not just about transatlantic security. It's a much more global outlook, and that's what I hinted to at the end of my presentation.
I think we'll have Axel Crow's question now. Oh, and
Thank you very much. Listening to your discussion, my thoughts went back to, I was a Moscow correspondent in the 70s, and it was détente. We covered the Nixon-Kissinger meetings. It was the beginning of START negotiations. American flags were flying in Moscow with Russian flags with the arrival of Nixon and Kissinger. And it's so striking that when you take that into account, what was happening under the Brezhnev era with the beginning of détente, as they called it, and then, of course, Gorbachev leaves you wondering whether we can get back to some kind of normal relationship. And it seems quite clearly the case with what you've been saying and what we've been hearing, that it's virtually impossible to see any immediate chance of having a dialogue of any kind with Putin. I understand that Mrs. Merkel told Obama very early after she had met with him, and as you know, she spoke fluent Russian, he spoke fluent German, so there was no language problem. And she told Obama there's no hope for it. I've talked with him, I know what he thinks and what he is, and we're not going to get anywhere. Well, that's where we are today, but that's not my question about Putin. I want to ask you about Zelensky. If I understand it, the going policy in the United States is to let Zelensky decide when the right moment will arrive to have negotiations. In other words, the negotiations eventually for a settlement of the Ukraine war is up to Zelensky. However, Kissinger, I gather, I didn't read the whole statement, Kissinger apparently has said it's very simple. He has to make a concession, Zelensky, if he wants to move on a negotiation. And that's my question. Is there an option that would be acceptable that would allow Zelensky to open negotiations with Moscow? What would it take? Kissinger suggested that the first step would be for Zelensky to give up the Donbass, for example. Something that Zelensky has said is impossible and unacceptable. But would there be a possibility, is it feasible, workable, that the United States, the Biden administration, could bring pressure on Zelensky, perhaps by holding back on some of the things he desperately wants, like highly sophisticated weapons, more Caesars, all things that he's asking for constantly. Do you think that the United States, that the Biden administration should put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate, as opposed to the current policy, which is to simply let him decide when it's the right moment? And certainly for the moment, he is saying no. He does not see any possibility of meeting these 10 points we just mentioned, or any other things, that there has to be a guarantee of the Ukraine's integrity, the Russians must withdraw, et cetera, et cetera. So is there wiggle room? Is there an option here for the United States, and for Europe for that matter, to have Zelensky take the initiative, as opposed to thinking that Putin himself would be willing to negotiate because of sanctions and possibly pressures within the Kremlin, which we don't know very much about?
Well, it's a pity we don't have a representative either from the Ukrainian government or the US government to tell us that, but we might try, we will try to answer. Are there other questions for now? Yes, we'll take a bunch.
Yes, so very briefly, when you discussed the possible future framework of security with Russia, do you ever take into consideration the fact that two major middle-ranking powers, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, are becoming increasingly untethered from US foreign policy, indeed European foreign policy? Does this ever come into the equation?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mathilde Vellier from the Geopolitics of Technology program here at Ifri. On another topic that has already been mentioned, the fact that the US long-term priority is, despite the war in Ukraine, China and not necessarily Russia. I had two quick questions. The first one being maybe directed rather to Emma Ashford. You mentioned the emerging critique of the bipartisan consensus on US foreign policy, and I was wondering if this also applied to the US-China policy, or if you felt that this competition with China was an area on which groupthink was sort of reigning with a more limited debate. And the second question is, how has the war in Ukraine affected the European position vis-a-vis not only the American foreign policy objectives towards Russia, but also towards China? Because the US has obviously been putting a lot of pressure towards European allies to see China as a threat the same way they do, and to adopt restrictions, for instance, on some technology. And I was wondering to what extent the war in Ukraine had changed the European position vis-a-vis the US on this. Thank you.
Well, these three questions cover a very wide scope. So may we turn to Emma first, because the last question was directed to you.
Sure, yeah. So this covers rather a lot of ground. So I guess to the first question, let me just briefly say, I think that the core problem or the core issue when we're talking about political settlement here is, as always, that we're looking at a set of interlocking domestic political dilemmas, right? Zelensky is going to find it hard to negotiate with Russia unless he has visible US arm twisting to point to, but the Biden administration will find it politically difficult at home to actually engage in that kind of arm twisting. So it will be much more difficult for them to actually put pressure on Kiev to negotiate. And then, we can talk about Vladimir Putin's domestic political limitations, but there are some, right? It's not that he has no limitations. So I don't know that I have much more to add there, but I think that remains this underlying political dilemma. On the questions about China, so it's, I think, quite interesting that if you look at the coalition that formed around the question of ending the war on terror, China was actually one of the rationales for some people within that coalition, to some extent myself included. The idea being that America should pull back from the Middle East, avoid getting bogged down in regime change wars, because we had this major strategic competitor rising in China. And so there are those who I think would have very strongly criticized US policy on Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, who are much more in line with a more hawkish consensus towards China. Now, I don't necessarily think that represents groupthink per se, because I think there's still a lot of divergences in opinion in how you handle China. And I think there are still those who would argue that, that China is not a major threat that the US needs to confront militarily. There are people who would argue that you need to do something, but not too much. And then there are some very hawkish people. But I think it's interesting just to note that the coalitions we saw challenging US foreign policy over the last few years have shifted, right? It's not the same coalition as it was a few years back. I'll defer the question on how the war in Ukraine has shaped European foreign policy. I'll defer that to my colleagues in Europe here.
Thank you. Can we turn to you again, Jacques? But the first question...
You certainly can, and I hope my voice will still be here to answer. On the first issue, it's very difficult to know what leverage one has on Zelensky and on Ukrainians. If somebody has leverage, then it's the United States more than anybody else. It's the main supplier of military might. And indeed, the Europeans are doing a major effort on all the other fronts, including refugees, economic aid, etc. But on the military front, at the end of the day, it's the United States. And therefore, the leverage would be strongest there. And it will very much depend on what the priorities would be in the United States. There may come a point, especially if the war were to drag on, that there may come an American administration saying, perhaps we can freeze the discussion about Crimea if we can get on with other issues. I don't know. This is just a hypothesis, but I don't believe the Europeans have such leverage because the Europeans actually are not united on that. It would be very, very. I mean, if that came to be discussed now among Europeans, it would be extremely sharp and possibly a fracture. Yeah, it would be a very, very tough debate among Europeans. So there is no such thing as a European position if that were on the agenda today. So only the Americans. And yeah, one can go back in history. Kissinger has been much debated now in Central Europe, in Poland, in Ukraine, etc. I mean, they all greatly respectful of Mr. Kissinger and his 100 years old experience. But there is a debate about what we could have done differently before. So that's a different debate. And in the foreign policy circle, certainly people are aware of that debate. But in the midst of the war, the Kissinger proposal, you can only achieve that if you accept giving away territory in the midst of a war. That is a very difficult proposition. Since I mentioned Brzezinski, the son, who is now ambassador in Poland, I remember the father, Zbig. I was with Zbig 20 years ago at a conference in Bratislava, where Zbig actually then advocated two things that would be, unpronounceable today, two F words. Yes, and one of them, he said, well, the thinking went like that, and I hope I'm saying this faithfully to my friends Big. He said, to be a democracy, Russia cannot be an empire. With Ukraine, it remains an empire. So that's the case for Ukrainian independence. However, for Russia to accept that proposition of not being an empire, Ukraine would have to accept two things. And these are the two F words. One is federalization, that is an internal, what he meant by that. I mean, he didn't actually say you need federalist papers or anything like that. No, you need a decentralized form of governance or autonomy. And secondly, Finlandization. What he meant by that, you accept not to be joining NATO. But that was way back. This was more than 20 years ago. This was before Putin was Putin. These were the days when President Bush, meeting with Putin in Ljubljana in 1991, at a press conference would say, and they would ask him about what he thought about Putin. And I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. That was a soul moment of American foreign policy under George W. Bush. Well, we know what happened to it after. So this is just to say this was a time when such speculations about Russia, Ukraine, Europe were possible. So-called realist approach. In the midst of a war, you don't start discussing, well, I'm maybe negotiating and ceding, freezing this territory or that. No, you fight the war. And if you don't, you will be pushed out and somebody else will fight it for you, because that's what Ukraine is today. It's a very strong determination. So this is my answer. Unlike the only leverage is American leverage, but it has also its limits on certain issues. Crimea may be possibly the one issue where that leverage can work. Second question that was mentioned is Turkey. Francis Gilles mentioned. this is the, you know, I said this is the American moment for East Central Europe. Well, regardless of East Central Europe, this is a Turkish moment. I mean, Turkey has suddenly appeared as the only one, as possibly, or at least the main mediator capable of talking to both sides, negotiating deals, you know, about, you remember the grain deal, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, no, this is the moment. Turkish domestic situation is terrible. The economy goes down the drain, the 100% inflation or what have you. But in terms of its international role, this is totally unprecedented. And of course, it poses question about what it will do with this influence, because it started first saying, well, we will use it as to veto the enlargement of NATO. So that's one way of perhaps not being in tune with what Washington thinking is, and especially what the thinking of the two countries concerned is. And well, I would have to say things about the last thing about the attitude to Ukraine and the impact on Asia. I think there are the two issues there that are, I think, of interest. One is, what does it mean for Russia to become, in the long term, the vassal of China? A long term. I mean, this is a prospect that Putin is offering his country, to become a vassal of a superpower with whom he has a 4,500 kilometers border, depopulated on one side and very dynamic on the other side. I mean, this will go down in history as a kind of suicidal Russian move. And the second thing, but that the others are better qualified to discuss that, is to what extent the Ukraine war is a precedent for Taiwan. And that would be more a question to Laurence about what the American take on that one could be.
Thank you, Jacques. It's definitely very interesting for us to have such a depth of perspective as you can give us, reminding us of what Bush was saying 20 years ago, and it's very useful. Thank you very much. Did you want to add something? It's yeah.
Yes, one of the problems with Finlandization is that Finland has moved since, and it probably says something about the context. To answer that question, my own thinking about that is that I don't see anyone trying to carve out Ukraine for the sake of a peace agreement, and I think the fact that there is since February 24th a direct war of aggression, even worse than what had started this war in 2014, makes it even more complicated to make any move in this direction. And so if ever the military operations were to stop before the whole of the Ukrainian territory were liberated from occupation, I think the end game would be something like with the Baltic states countries in the after Second World War period, where everybody said we don't recognize the annexation of the Baltic states. And at first everybody said, yeah, very good, very principled decision. And then time passed and people started to say, well, it doesn't make sense anymore. It's a de facto situation. You might as well recognize it. Why are you sticking to this principled position? It's too, and after over 45 years, at the end, it made sense. And when the Baltic states became independent again, de facto, the absence of recognition of the annexation and the recognition of their independence in this long period of occupation made sense. And I don't think any prolonged occupation of Crimea would translate into recognition of the annexation. On the autonomization and diversification of several countries' foreign policy, there is indeed a return to the idea of autonomization or non-alignment, or you have a lot of concepts that are being brought back in the foreign policy discussion by various countries. I think there is a trend across the world of diversification of not just economic relations, but actually the whole of your relations. It's just that it doesn't have to mean a very transactional and short-term approach to this diversification. I think there is a trend of autonomization, which makes a lot of sense for several countries. Everybody who works on transatlantic relations is obsessed with European strategic autonomy. But if you look at Indians, New Delhi speaks about autonomy or strategic autonomy all the time. And the US is more and more friendly and close to India and doesn't think that it's a big deal that Indians say that they don't want to be a treaty ally and that they like their strategic autonomy. But autonomization doesn't mean that you have to be autonomous at the expense of the key principle of the rules-based order. And I know the Turks would like us to believe that they are mediators. They are balancing in a way that allows them to have a hosting role for some kind of talks, but I'm not sure they are mediating in the true substantial sense of the word. What these trends and all the various ways to do these autonomization or diversification kind of strategies bring us back to an issue for all of us, NATO countries or Western countries or North countries or etc., which is our credibility. I think most of these countries at the beginning didn't take harsh and strong positions on the war in Ukraine because they thought, well, the West is going to make a big fuss about it, is going to adopt sanctions, but the Russians will be in Kyiv in a few days, and then there will be a new facts on the ground, new fait accompli, and, well, things are going to be basically nudged into some kind of long, prolonged diplomatic discussion, and we can get away with it. And what is really striking is that precisely time is not working how Putin thought it would be and how these countries thought it would be. And now you have some countries like India who are starting to say explicitly and in public things that they were not saying even in private at the beginning. You including have China, and I'm sure China is very happy with the idea that the US are occupied and have to deal with the situation in Ukraine, but they are saying things in public to Putin in terms of they don't really like the instability that comes with the war, and they would be really, really, really concerned if there was any move towards any escalation that would cross the nuclear threshold. So not everybody is getting more nervous and more vocal about that. And those who are not necessarily big supporters of Ukraine independence or the UN Charter principles, but I think it's interesting to have this in mind. And on the change of policy by Europeans vis-à-vis China, I don't think there was much of that. I think it's striking that most Europeans have not dropped the idea that you need to do more vis-à-vis China or vis-à-vis the Indo-Pacific in general, because the bandwidth is basically fully mobilized by the situation in Ukraine and the war by Russia. But there is still a strong preference by most, if not all, Europeans for avoiding any confrontational strategy vis-à-vis China. And there is still, I think, a perception that irrespective of the way the US are trying to, this current US administration is trying to frame its China policy or its Indo-Pacific policy, there is a perception by the countries of the region that it's still very confrontational and that this raises some kind of problem. And the Europeans believe that indeed the parts of the strategy vis-à-vis China has to do with how you listen and pay attention and partner and help and offer options to the countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Manuel. I suspect we're out of questions. And so since we're short of one speaker, we may finish.
We actually have one, if you want.
Really? Well,
yes, we do. if we have time.
Yes, we do. We have 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Another fairly important actor maybe in Ukraine has recently been Iran, especially with drones that have been used by Russia. So one question is, we've seen that talks and negotiation for the Iranian nuclear deal are pretty much out of the question right now. But in your opinion, should the US particularly try harder, and can they actually do something about this nuclear deal in the foreseeable future? And what could also Europe do in favor of that deal, or won't do? Thank you.
Yeah, well, very wise to add the Iran issue to this debate. I suggest we make it the concluding remarks by the three of you. Who wants to go first? Maybe we'll finish with Emma. Tu veux recommencer? Sorry.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the Iranian sale of drones to Russia really changes the way we should address the nuclear deal negotiations. You may have seen that the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was in Bahrain a few weeks ago at the Manama Dialogue, and she made a statement by which she mentioned that for the EU, it was, for some EU members, it was a wake-up call to realize that the instability, the destabilization activities by Iran were not limited to the Middle East, and therefore the EU needed to take that into account in the way it wants to deal with the Gulf partners and address the situation. And the policy, the EU policy can't be just about the nuclear deal. But it's been a while now that the policy vis-à-vis Iran is not just about the nuclear deal, and it's not just about the drones, it's also about the demonstrations in the streets of Iranian cities, etc. And there is still an effort to pressure Iran into a revived version of the JCPOA, because there is still the conviction that this is the best way to delay and postpone the horizon of Iran going nuclear.
Very briefly, what I see, I'm not at all an expert on Iran, but I think that the Iran question fits with the Biden agenda on democracy and democracy versus autocracy as a way of framing the current international major issue. We have simultaneously a crisis in the three dictatorships. China is undergoing crisis. We have seen protests and the regime even backing down on some of its policy. Russia, I don't believe this regime can survive the defeat that it is now going through in the war in Ukraine. And the Iranian regime is perhaps not immune as well. So there is in the agenda of the Biden administration, democracy versus autocracy, there may be something there. As I said, they have a blind spot about Poland and about some of the countries that are sort of backsliding on democracy and the rule of law for various strategic reasons. But I would say the Iranian issue should fit into this broader framework in the framing of American foreign policy.
Emma, you'll have the last word, but before I give the floor to you, I will remind everybody that we just put out a paper on Iranian-American negotiations and how bad they're going, actually. It's in the blue folder that each of you is welcome to. So yes, Emma, is the diplomatic and sanction effort by the US in Iran due to fail? Should it continue? What's your view on this?
Yeah, well, thank you so much all for coming today as well. I think it's been a really great conversation. So I think, you know, to Jacques' point there, one of the ironies of this whole thing is that the Biden administration frames its policy in terms of democracy versus autocracy. What we're seeing in Iran right now is one of the ways in which states become more democratic, right? Protests lead to concessions, etc. But with the sort of imperatives of US foreign policy, with the way the policy debate in DC is structured, this is not necessarily going to lead to better US-Iranian relations. And in fact, these protests may end up getting in the way of the Biden administration's ability to pull out anything on the arms control front. I mean, I think the JCPOA is dead, effectively, in Washington. Basically, I think that's a consensus viewpoint. There's really nobody trying to resurrect it at this point. And I think the big question for 2023 is the extent to which this will then prompt a crisis in US-Iranian relations. You know, will the Iranians push forward with enrichment? Will they start to do weapons development in ways that will, you know, push a debate in Washington that will push the Biden administration to take some action? Or will the regime in Tehran, you know, focused on the protests and other things, keep a relatively low profile there, which might then allow the Biden administration to sort of just continue to coast on this question? Iran, unfortunately, I think is one of these issues where in Washington, the contours of the debate are such that it is very difficult to have anything other than an extremely hawkish approach to Tehran. And so I think the best case scenario is basically the status quo here continues, and that's not great, but that I think is actually the best case scenario. The worst case scenario would be that we actually see a crisis in US-Iranian relations sometime in the new year.
Thank you. So on this point of interrogation, I think we'll conclude our debate today, or debates today, sorry. I'll see you all next year. Thank you very much for coming. And, oh no, a word, sorry. I want to thank the whole team at Ifri, because this is a team effort, and everybody up there and at the front desk and in all the level at Ifri has been helping us doing this, and I want to thank them very much. Please join me and let's thank them all. Thank you. And thank you, Emma, for joining us. I hope you'll be healed very soon.